And the heart of the Christian faith is obviously Jesus' incarnation, God becoming human, and then dying on the cross so that all of us as sinners can take that atonement, Jesus dying as God, and accept that, and so that applies to us, and that absolves us in some way of our sin, and we can proceed on the salvation path. What I want to try to understand is the philosophical underpinnings of that atonement process. What I just said is kind of a superficial comment that you hear frequently. But as a philosopher, analytic philosopher, and taking that approach, how do we dig into that atonement and what's really happening?
Okay. Yes, atonement comes from the three words at-one-ment, of course. So the suggestion is that an alienated humanity is, by an act of divine grace, brought to a position of being at one with God and God's purposes for humanity. Okay, and that is done by grace in the person of Jesus Christ. So
in that case, what does grace mean there? I mean, I know Jesus died, and then we have to kind of appropriate that for our payment of sin or something. But what does the grace mean in that context? It's a word, everybody thinks they understand it, but I don't understand it.
Yes, and grace in this context simply means this. It recognizes the fact that there's no way that an alienated humanity could, in and of itself, bring itself to be at one with God.
Right.
And therefore, God fulfills what human beings couldn't do for themselves.
And that's the act of grace?
And that's an act of grace.
Okay.
Exactly, free grace.
Right.
He wasn't obliged to do it. There was no necessity. It was an act of free grace, an expression of God's free love for an alienated
Now, the way that
humanity.
happens is by use of Jesus' death. So how is that literally working?
Right. Well, not quite. It concerns Jesus' life and death.
Okay.
Now, let me explain, because, again, the vast majority, particularly of the Protestant, but also the Catholic tradition, focuses on Jesus' death. Usually the phrase is the work of Christ on the cross, right? The work of atonement on the cross. And I just think that's ill-conceived. And to try and understand, I think, what's going on, here we've got to do the exegetical theology as well as the analytic, is we take the word Paul uses for redemption, apolutrosis, and look at its Jewish roots. Just get some sense as to what it means in the mind of Paul, who is a Jew, okay? And there are at least three, there's a whole raft of relevant background, but just the three key Hebrew concepts. One, pada, the idea that God delivered his people who were from slavery, from bondage in Israel, in Egypt, by his mighty arm. Okay? That's an act of redemption, delivering people from slavery. So that's one element. And then there's the Kippur Kofer tradition, where with the sacrificial sacrifice at Yom Kippur, and where it's a way, just to put it very briefly, where God declares to Israel that they are delivered from the sin by means of a life given in their place. Again, this is not trying to attempt to buy off God, right, with sacrifices, categorically not. It's a provision within the Torah, an expression of grace, whereby God would tell a wayward people, you are forgiven, right? And so at the heart of the cult, they would, there'd be the sacrifice of the animal, or they'd watch the scapegoat run off into into the wilderness, and this was a celebration of God's endless covenant commitment, covenant love for his people. Okay, so that's the Kippur Kofer element, and then there's the Goel or Gaal element, which refers to a kinsman redeemer, whereby if somebody loses their inheritance, okay, by whatever means, perhaps their husband dies, a brother steps in as Goel and restores a family to an inheritance that's lost, or a brother loses his farm and the other brother buys it back for him to restore him to lost inheritance. And for Paul, when he's using the word apolutrosis, all these three concepts kind of intertwined like strands of a rope, are coming together in his interpretation of what's going on in Jesus Christ. Here we're seeing the covenant God, who in an act of unconditioned and unconditional love for an alienated people, wants to deliver them from the bondage of sin. Because we're not just talking about peccadillos, or sin's not about sins. Sin's about a disease, about dysfunctionality. What causes ethnic cleansing and holocausts and devastates marriage? It's a disease, okay? And so at the heart of the atonement is this doctrine of redemption, whereby in Christ, God's coming to deliver us from this disease, deliver us from bondage, from captivity to it, in a way that takes the costliness of it seriously, the whole sacrificial thing. By the way, the sacrifice, the focus of sacrifice is not on the cross. There's some superb scholarship going on right now by exegetical theologians on this topic. The sacrifice is completed in the Holy of Holies, of course, as it was in the Jewish scriptures. And so the ascension is absolutely key to Paul's understanding, and certainly Hebrews' understanding of atonement. And then the third element. How does all this happen? Because Christ comes as our kinsman redeemer, flesh of our flesh, blood of our blood, bone of our bone, to restore us as the second Adam to the inheritance that was lost in Adam, in the fall. So that's what Paul's trying to communicate. Okay. Now the other key word he uses here is reconciliation, the Greek word katalogē, and alassine means to exchange. Kata is an emphatic. I think that the fathers got it right when they summarize this by saying, God takes what is ours and transforms it so that we might have what is his, that we might share in the love that is the purpose for the contingent order.
Are there any boundaries of what God does in this forgiveness process?
Great question. I think there aren't. I think there are no boundaries to forgiveness. And indeed, further than that, I think God forgives us prior to any atonement. The atonement is an expression of God's love and forgiveness for his people. I actually don't think it makes any sense to say that one loves a person unconditionally, but one's not going to forgive them.
What about after, if somebody dies and does not accept Jesus or rejects Jesus affirmatively? What happens then? Does God then close the door on forgiveness? If you say that God's forgiveness has no bounds, is the no bounds terminated? Is the no bounds a covenant or agreement terminated with death?
Great question. And everybody fears that, conservative Christian fans would fear that my position commits us to universalism. I'm actually not a universalist.
Why is that a fear?
That's a good question. That's a good question. So here's my response. Number one, it's not possible to be a Christian and want hell to be populated. It's not possible to be a Christian and want hell to be populated. To love your enemies, right, as Christ loves his enemies, is to want hell to be empty. Okay, so I've got a real problem with all forms of Christianity that want to see a population there. Number two, to the extent that hell is populated, it is populated by people who are loved by God, right? And in my view, for whom Christ died, as we find in Peter, and those who reject the Lord who bought them. Okay, so it's God's love, covenant love, and faithfulness all the way down, right, even into hell. So to the extent that people occupy hell, it is not because they're not forgiven. There are no boundaries to God's forgiveness.